There is a particular kind of adult moment that most people recognize but few people have a name for. You are a fully grown, intelligent, capable person. And then something happens. Your partner uses a certain tone, your boss gives a particular look, someone you love withdraws slightly, and something in you responds with an intensity that is completely disproportionate to the actual event. The fear that floods in feels enormous. The shame is immediate and total. The need for reassurance, for approval, for someone to tell you everything is okay, feels urgent in a way that is almost embarrassing. And a part of you, even in the middle of it, knows that this reaction doesn't quite belong to the present moment. That it feels old. That you have been here before, many times, in a way that has nothing to do with this specific Tuesday. That is the inner child. Not a metaphor for being childish. Not a self-help cliché. A real, neurobiologically grounded, psychologically significant part of the self, formed in early experience, held in the body and in implicit memory, and capable of running your adult life from a developmental age of 4 or 6 or 9 until it receives the one thing it never got, the experience of being seen, held, and healed. Today we are building a rigorous, grounded, clinically precise map of what the inner child actually is, where the concept comes from, what the neuroscience says about why it is real, how it shows up in adult behavior, and what inner child work actually involves at its most effective. The inner child work cheat sheet is linked in the description. Let's begin. Section 1. Where the concept comes from. The inner child is not a social media invention. Its roots run deep in the history of psychological thought, and tracing those roots reveals that this concept has been independently arrived at by some of the most rigorous minds in the field across different theoretical traditions, because it maps onto something real that clinical observation keeps encountering. Carl Jung was among the first to give it formal theoretical attention, describing what he called the divine child archetype, the representation in the psyche of the original, innocent, undamaged self that exists prior to the wounds and adaptations of lived experience. For Jung, the child archetype represented not regression, but wholeness, the self before it was divided by necessity, by loss, by the requirements of adaptation to an imperfect world. Donald Winnicott, the British paediatrician and psychoanalyst whose work on early development remains foundational, described the concept of the true self and the false self, the authentic, spontaneous, feeling self that develops under conditions of good enough caregiving, and the compliant, performing, survival-oriented self that develops when the environment requires the child to be other than it genuinely is. The true self, in Winnicott's framework, does not disappear when it is suppressed by developmental necessity. It goes underground, and it remains there, accessible under the right conditions, waiting. John Bradshaw, the therapist and author who brought inner child work into popular consciousness in the 1980s and 1990s through his books and public television programs, synthesized the theoretical tradition with practical methodology and made the concept accessible to millions of people who recognized their experience in his descriptions with startling immediacy. His framework of the wounded inner child, the part of the self that carries the unhealed wounds of childhood and continues to drive adult behavior from those wounds, remains one of the most widely applied frameworks in experiential and humanistic therapy. And today, the inner child concept finds rigorous theoretical grounding in internal family systems, in attachment theory, in schema therapy, and in developmental neuroscience, all of which, from their different vantage points, arrive at the same fundamental insight: that early experience creates internal structures that persist, that these structures continue to influence adult functioning in measurable ways, and that healing requires engaging with them directly, rather than simply managing their effects. Section 2. The Neuroscience. Why the inner child is real. For those who need the science before the concept fully lands, and there is nothing wrong with needing that. The neuroscience of early development provides direct, empirical grounding for everything the inner child framework describes. The brain develops from the bottom up and from the outside in. The subcortical structures, the brainstem, the limbic system, the amygdala, develop first and develop rapidly in the earliest years of life. The cortical structures, the prefrontal cortex, the seat of reasoning, reflection, and executive function, develop last and are not fully mature until the mid-20s. What this means is that the experiences of early childhood are encoded primarily by the very structures that are most responsible for emotional response, threat detection, and relational pattern recognition, before the reflective, reasoning brain has the capacity to contextualize, interpret, or override them. These early experiences are encoded as implicit memory, the non-declarative, non-narrative, body-based memory system that stores procedural learning, emotional conditioning, and relational templates below the level of conscious access. Implicit memory does not announce itself. It does not say, "This feeling comes from what happened to you at age 5. It simply activates as a physical sensation, an emotional surge, a behavioral impulse, a relational expectation. In response to present moment triggers that resemble, in some encoded way, the conditions under which the original experience was formed. This is the neuroscience of why the inner child runs adult behavior without the adult's conscious awareness or consent. The patterns are not in the narrative memory that can be examined and reasoned with. They are in the body, in the nervous system, in the implicit relational knowing that was built before language, and that operates faster than thought. When the adult's nervous system encounters a present moment trigger that matches an early encoded experience of threat, abandonment, shame, or helplessness, the implicit memory system activates. The emotional response that floods the adult body in that moment is not irrational. It is a perfectly precise response to a threat that existed decades ago, being replayed through a nervous system that has not been updated. The inner child, neurobiologically, is these implicit memory networks, the emotionally charged, relationally patterned, developmentally frozen neural states that were formed in early experience and that continue to shape perception, emotion, and behavior in the present. They are not metaphor, they are structure, and structure can be changed, not through insight alone, but through the corrective emotional experiences that inner child work is specifically designed to provide. Section 3. How the wounded inner child shows up in adults. The inner child does not announce its presence. It shows up in the quality of adult experience in ways that are often attributed to personality, character, or simply the way a person is, without any recognition that what is actually operating is an early neural state activated in the present. The most common signature is disproportionate emotional reactivity. Reactions whose intensity is out of proportion to the actual present moment trigger. The fight with a partner that escalates in a way that feels catastrophic. The criticism from a colleague that lands with the weight of total rejection. The moment of being overlooked in a group that produces a shame response so complete it takes hours to recover from. These responses are not evidence of being dramatic or unstable. They are evidence that the present trigger has reached down into an implicit memory network and activated an emotional state that belongs to a much younger, much more vulnerable version of the person. Relationship patterns are perhaps the most visible arena in which inner child states operate. The attachment wounds of early childhood, experiences of abandonment, inconsistency, criticism, emotional unavailability, enmeshment, or outright abuse, create relational templates, expectations about how close relationships work, about whether other people can be trusted to stay, about whether one's own needs are welcome or dangerous. These templates are not updated simply by encountering different experiences. They are updated by specific kinds of relational experiences that reach the implicit memory level, which is work and good attachment-informed therapy provide. Self-talk is another arena. The inner critic, the relentless internal voice that delivers harsh evaluations of the self, is almost universally, in clinical work, the voice of an early caregiver internalized and replayed. The child who was told they were not enough, or too much, or a disappointment, or responsible for things that were not their responsibility, does not simply grow out of that internalized voice. They carry it forward as a self-evaluative system that continues to process experience through the lens of what was communicated in those early years. The inner critic is not the enemy. It's a wounded child doing the only thing it knows to do to keep the person safe by preemptively delivering the judgment it learned to expect. And self-sabotage, the patterns that interrupt success, connection, and fulfillment at precisely the moments they become most available, is often the inner child, operating from the implicit belief that good things are not safe, are not for me, or will inevitably be taken away. The adult who cannot let themselves be fully happy, fully successful, fully loved, is often an inner child who learned that visibility was dangerous, that having was followed by losing, or that being too much of anything brought punishment. Section 4. The inner child is not one thing. One of the most important clinical refinements in modern inner child work is the recognition that the inner child is not a single entity, but a constellation of states, different ages, different wounds, different emotional charges that were formed at different developmental moments and that carry different burdens. Internal family systems, which we have explored in other videos in this series, provides one of the most clinically precise frameworks for this multiplicity. In IFS, the exile parts, the vulnerable young parts that carry the emotional wounds of early experience, are what most people mean when they say inner child. And IFS is explicit that there are many of them. A 4-year-old exile, carrying the shame of a specific moment of humiliation. An 8-year-old exile carrying the loneliness of a parent who was consistently emotionally unavailable. An 11-year-old exile carrying the fear of a period of family chaos. Each one distinct. Each one carrying its specific burden. Each one deserving of its own specific healing. Schema therapy, developed by Jeffrey Young and grounded in cognitive behavioral theory, offers another map through the concept of early maladaptive schemas. Deep, pervasive themes about oneself and one's relationships, formed in childhood in response to unmet core needs that organize perception and behavior across the lifespan. Schemas like abandonment, defectiveness, subjugation, and emotional deprivation are, essentially, the cognitive and emotional architecture of wounded inner child states. The beliefs the child formed about themselves and the world in the attempt to make sense of experiences that were not adequately met. Attachment theory contributes the relational dimension, the internal working models formed in the earliest attachment relationships, the implicit expectations about whether the self is worthy of care and whether others can be relied upon to provide it, are the inner child's relational blueprint. Secure, anxious, avoidant, and disorganized attachment styles are not fixed personality traits. They are learned relational strategies developed in response to specific, early caregiving experiences. And they can be updated, not through willpower or insight, but through the kind of consistent, safe, attuned relational experience that inner child work and good therapy are specifically designed to provide. What unifies these frameworks, IFS's exiles, schema therapy's early maladaptive schemas, attachment theory's internal working models, is the recognition that early experience creates internal structures that persist and that drive present behavior from below the level of conscious awareness. The inner child is not one thing, it is many things. And healing is not a single event. It is the patient, compassionate, repeated work of finding each wounded state, witnessing it, and offering it something it has never received. Section 5. What inner child work? actually involves. Inner child work suffers in the popular imagination from a significant image problem. It is associated with visualization exercises that seem sentimental, with talking to photographs of one's younger self, with emotional catharsis that looks dramatic from the outside. And while some of these approaches have genuine clinical utility in the right context, they represent a small slice of what inner child work actually involves at its most effective, and they have given the broader framework an air of soft self-help that seriously undersells its clinical power. At its core, inner child work is about creating a new relational experience for the parts of the self that formed in the absence of what they needed and did not receive what they needed at the time they needed it. It is corrective emotional experience at the level of implicit memory. And it works not because talking about the inner child produces insight, but because the specific quality of the therapeutic or self-relational encounter, safe, consistent, non-judgmental, genuinely curious about the child's experience, begins to update the implicit memory networks in ways that cognitive approaches alone cannot reach. The first element of effective inner child work is accessing the state. The inner child cannot be healed through talking about it from the adult's perspective. It must be encountered in something closer to its own state. This is why effective inner child work often involves sensory approaches, photographs from childhood, music that activates early memories, body-based practices that drop below the cognitive level and into the felt sense of the young state. The goal is not to be overwhelmed by the state. That is re-traumatization, not healing. The goal is titrated access, enough contact with the young state to be in genuine relationship with it, with enough adult resourcing to provide what the state needs rather than being consumed by it. The second element is witnessing, the act of truly seeing the inner child's experience. What was it like to be that child in that situation, with those specific unmet needs? Not from the adult's perspective of understanding what the parents were going through, not from the perspective of minimizing what happened relative to other people's experiences, not from the perspective of gratitude for what was provided. From the child's perspective, with the child's experience held as real, valid, and worthy of acknowledgement exactly as it was. This witnessing, particularly when it occurs in the presence of a therapist who can reflect it back, is often described as one of the most profound experiences in the entire therapeutic process. The child that was not seen is finally seen. The experience that was not validated is finally validated. And something in the nervous system that has been organized around the absence of that validation begins slowly to reorganize. The third element is reparenting, the deliberate provision from the adult self or from the therapeutic relationship of what the child needed and did not receive. This might be comfort, protection, reassurance, delight, boundaries, permission to exist fully without performance. Reparenting is not pretending that the original caregiving was adequate or that it didn't matter. It is supplementing what was missing at the level where it was missing. Not through thought, but through the kind of warm, consistent, attuned relational presence that was not available then, and that is available now. The fourth element is integration, the gradual weaving of the healed inner child state back into the full self, so that it is no longer frozen at the age of the wound, no longer driving adult behavior from a developmental stage that does not have access to adult resources, but brought forward into the present with all of the adult's current capacity available to it. Integration is not the end of the work. The inner child states do not disappear. They become less extreme, less easily activated, less consuming when they are activated. The adult can feel the young state without being taken over by it, can recognize it, can offer it what it needs in the moment, and can return to present function. This is the horizon of inner child healing, not a self without young parts, but a self that is in relationship with them rather than at their mercy. The inner child work cheat sheet in the description inner child activation and the core elements of the healing process in one organized, clinically useful reference for personal work and therapeutic use. The inner child is real, not as a figure of speech, not as a metaphor for immaturity, not as a nostalgic softening of serious psychological work, but as a genuine, neurobiologically grounded, clinically significant dimension of the self that formed in early experience and that continues to shape adult life in ways both visible and invisible. The patterns you cannot think your way out of, the reactions that feel disproportionate even as they are happening, the relationships that keep arriving at the same impasse despite your best intentions, the voice that speaks harshest about you in the moments when you most need support. These are not evidence of who you are. They are evidence of what you learned early in conditions that asked too much of someone too young to know that what was being communicated was not the truth about them. The work of healing the inner child is the work of going back for the part of yourself that was left behind, not to relive the past, not to be consumed by it, but to offer that part of yourself the one thing that changes everything, the experience of being found, being seen, being told by the only person whose telling can fully reach that level, that it was never their fault, that they were always enough, and that they no longer have to manage the world from the age at which they got stuck. That work is available to you at any age, regardless of how long the patterns have been running. The nervous system is plastic. The inner child is not fixed in its wound. And the relationship you build with the youngest, most vulnerable parts of yourself is one of the most profound and most durable changes a human being can make. The cheat sheet is in the description. Share this video with someone whose reactions sometimes feel older than they do. They may need this more